Australian to the world. Rabbi Feldman hails from Bondi. He's a fifth-generation Australian rabbi, specialising in the academic fields of Jewish philosophy and mysticism. He's now based in Canberra, here with his wife, Chasia, and their 6 kids. The rabbi is the chairman of Chabad and acts as the federal political liaison of the Rabbinical Council of Australia and New Zealand. We're going to have what I think is going to be a really enlightening, hopefully thought-provoking address from the rabbi. We look forward to it. Please welcome Rabbi Feldman.
Thank you so much, Richard, for the beautiful words, and I acknowledge traditional custodians of this land, their elders past and present. I want to give special thanks to the sponsors of this wonderful event, the Parliamentary Friends of Multiculturalism, Maria, Russell, and Richard, doing a fantastic job, and we all are indebted to you for it. I want to acknowledge Religions for Peace, one of the sponsors of this, organizer of this event, and all of their members here, and particularly the Canberra Interfaith Forum, and our Jewish long-standing representative on the forum, Mr. Harry Opperman, fellow faith leaders, your excellencies, honourable members of parliament, senators, friends, all. I recently saw a panel where a mufti, a priest, and a rabbi were sitting together, and somebody posed the question to them: what would you like to have said at your funeral, lying there in the casket? What do you want them to say about you? Well, the priest went first and said, I want them to say that I put the needs of my flock before my own. The Mufti next says, I want them to say about me that I expanded my reach beyond my mosque. Rabbi's turn, he says, I want them to point the finger at my casket and say, look, he's breathing! We're the most successful multicultural society in the world. I just heard that from Richard. I hear that often by politicians. I don't know who coined that phrase, but I do know that it is often repeated. As a matter of fact, at an event not too dissimilar to this one here, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull shared afterwards on his Facebook page a picture of me standing between him and Bill Shorten, the Honourable Bill Shorten, and several other faith leaders and politicians around, and the text on that picture read, there was no projector available, so I have these props. Going old school. We are the most successful multicultural society in the world. So this is often stated, this is proof positive that we are, right? So I want to challenge you all here a little bit this evening on that. Before I give you my thoughts on the matter, let me begin with a bit of my own familial background. I, like Richard and so many others, owe my very existence to this country. My great-great-grandfather, Nosson Sokochevsky, who was a rabbi, was later anglicized to Chester, was fortunate to find a safe haven on the shores of Australia together with some lucky family members after fleeing from anti-Semitic pogroms in Poland. Pogroms were the organized massacres of Jews throughout Poland and Russia and that vicinity. Years later, another grandfather, Rabbi Chaim Gutnick, following the outbreak of the Second World War and just prior to the Nazi invasion and occupation of Lithuania in 1941, fled on the last civilian boat to make it out of Lithuania. Now let's bear in mind, for context, that only 1 out of 100 Jews in Poland and Lithuania survived the Holocaust. My grandfather was studying in a rabbinical seminary away from his home in England. The boat was diverted from England, the intended destination, and ended up in Australia. Shortly afterwards, he enlisted in the Australian Army, prepared to make the greatest sacrifice of all in fighting the Nazis and their allies to protect his own newfound freedom in Australia. His father had passed away years earlier, and his mother, Chaya, in England, had no way of contacting him or knowing about his fate. She feared the worst and found no peace. 2 years later, she saw a photo on the front page of a London newspaper and pictured there were a group of Australian soldiers. She recognized her son Chaim as one of those soldiers. Years later, they reunited in Australia. I have been preceded and blessed to have had generations of fine Jewish Australians come before me who have contributed tirelessly to our society whilst remaining openly observant Jews. But are we the most successful multicultural society in the world? If one was to look at a gathering like we have tonight, religious leaders coming together in peace, supported by politicians on all sides of the political divide, you could be mistaken to think that indeed all Australians are living in some sort of multicultural utopia. So let me illustrate from some of my own personal experience. I have visited and studied in many different countries. I can tell you with certainty that Australia is the luckiest and best country in the world. I feel so proud and fortunate to call Australia home. Whenever I return from trips overseas and hear Qantas play that classic, I still call Australia home, you just, no matter how many times I've touched down, I get swept and overcome with emotions and have to hold back those tears. We have a tremendous amount to be thankful for, in that Australian policy has become one of pluralism and a welcoming safe haven for those who are so-called different, yet united by a common set of values. But we probably still have a little bit more work to do in the areas of fostering real tolerance and harmony for our children to coexist successfully. Because one has to ask, if we are indeed such a successful multicultural society, then why is it that hate crimes and racial vilification in Australia are on the rise? The Executive Council of Australian Jewry keeps a record on most hate crimes reported by the Jewish community throughout the country. And guess what? We have seen a staggering year-on-year growth of hate crimes, an increase of 59% from the previous 12-month period this year. It's an unprecedented percentage increase. Identifiably Jewish Australians continue to be verbally abused and harassed on a regular basis, especially over the Jewish Sabbath and on Jewish festivals. There are growing segments within the Australian society which are not only hostile towards Jews, but actively and publicly express that hatred with threats or actual violent acts. As a result, and by necessity, physical security remains a prime concern for the Jewish community. As far-right and far-left groups increasingly become more emboldened and more active in denigrating, demonizing, and inciting violence against Jews, it is incumbent upon political and other leaders to demonstrate through their actions that anti-Semitism and all forms of racism is not acceptable in Australia, and to ensure that strong policies, laws, and other measures are continually adopted and implemented in order to effectively counter anti-Semitism. International experts on human behavior are suggesting that the honeymoon the Jews experienced in the Western world following the Holocaust was coming to an end, and the collective amnesia was beginning to set in. As has repeatedly happened throughout our history, the repugnant and vile sickness called anti-Semitism just never seems to disappear, and was shamelessly starting to rear its ugly head again. In Europe especially, where now Jews in the UK and France are leaving in record numbers, in the US, and yes, even at home in Australia. Growing up in Bondi, which is situated in the second largest Jewish electorate in the country, you would think that we had it easy. Let me say this, not a weekend went by without at least a few of us children having racial abuse hurled at us on the street on the way to or from the synagogue. We were sheltered from the abuse while at school, as we luckily attended a Jewish private school in Bondi, one of the many educational institutions that my illustrious parents, Rabbi Pinchas, OAM, and Rebbetzin Penina Feldman, selflessly spent their lives building. But many of those in other schools were regularly subjected to racism. It was just part of life, especially during times of conflict in the Middle East. It is important here to stress the centrality of Israel for the Jewish people. In addition to the undeniable religious and indigenous connection of nearly 4,000 years that every Jew has to the land of Israel, in today's world, the State of Israel serves as the principal symbol of Judaism internationally. It is the one nation state of the Jewish people and continues to serve as the only desperately needed homeland for persecuted Jews wherever they are in the world. Throughout the ages, anti-Semitism has been expressed against Jewish symbols as a cover for not hating Jews, just their religion, or just their race, or just their looks, or just their traditions, and now just their land. Whilst, of course, not everyone who is critical of Israeli policy is an anti-Semite, I have some policy issues myself, but one needs to be cognizant that studies continue to show that many in that space are closet anti-Semites who pose as anti-Zionists as an avenue to express their Jew hatred without social repercussion. And anti-Israel movements like the BDS continue to attract rabid anti-Semites, especially online. Often these people are not only tolerated, but are embraced. Conspiracy theories about Jews abound, as do calls for the destruction of Israel. Many seem more concerned with hating Israel as a Jewish state than with supporting suffering Arabs. Their agenda then becomes obvious. As a response to the rise in hate crimes, the Jewish community rallied together and set up their own security arrangements with the support of police, with volunteers now guarding Jewish synagogues and schools. Then armed guards were and are employed to protect many of these venues in multicultural Australia. I recall being deeply affected as a child when the Holocaust survivors, predominantly from Hungary, in my father's synagogue, told me their stories of survival and the death and suffering that they left behind. In 1944 Hungary, following the Nazi invasion, most of Hungary's large and vibrant Jewish community were deported to the death camps. A young 13-year-old Frank survived by evading and outsmarting the Gestapo and ended up in Australia in the 1950s. For years, he longed to find out the fate of his beloved father Hugo and how and where he perished in the Holocaust. Most of his mother's side had also perished at the hands of the Nazis. Frank went into business in Sydney with a fellow Hungarian Jewish refugee, John, who had a similar background. Frank worked hard selling sandwiches and John as a packer, and together put their savings together to take risk and create opportunity. The company they created was called Westfield. Sir Frank Lowy AC and the late John Saunders' contribution to Australia in so many areas has been nothing short of outstanding. One of Frank's defining moments was when he ultimately learned how his father had died. Hugo was deported to Auschwitz, and upon emerging from the cattle cars, the Nazis insisted that they leave all their luggage behind. He refused to give them over his prayer shawl and tefillin, the phylacteries we religious Jewish men pray with. So the enlightened SS soldiers brutally beat him to death. Hugo had died for his religious beliefs. He died as he lived, as a proud Jew. Mr. Lowy's story is not at all unique. Following Israel, Australia has the highest per capita number of Holocaust survivors than in any other country. So with stories like these, the name callings growing up didn't seem that bad. We had it pretty good. Our grandparents had to flee the Holocaust, pogroms, and communism. Here, the government and police were on our side. After all, it was only a minority who were doing it. It was a minority of migrants from the Middle East and then from former Nazi collaborationist states who came over with lots of hatred towards Jews in Israel and thought it fair game to let it out on anyone who looks Jewish. It was a minority of Christian Australians who grew up with the age-old anti-Semitic education and conspiracy theories that Jews are money-hungry, world-dominating, weather-controlling Christ killers. and are therefore all culpable for the rest of eternity. I have met several of those. It was another minority who just thought we weren't Australian enough because we dress funny and should just be Australian. It was another minority of white supremacists who thought our race should simply not exist. The racism and anti-Semitism we experienced did not come from any one political party. It comes from the far left, the far right, extremist people of religion, and your everyday so-called bogans in the middle who had little to no regard for the dignity of difference. So as the years went by, we were constantly reminded that we are the other. Until today, nearly every day, when I am out and about, the first question I am asked is what? Where are you from? To which I respond, well, originally Bondi. Yeah, but before that, where were you from? Israel, yeah? As if to say you can't possibly be true blue Aussie or fair dinkum dressed the way you are. And I see people here nodding in concurrence that they may have some similar experiences, and we'll get to that soon. Sometimes I offer the question of some free education in response. In 1788, about 16 Jewish convicts arrived in Australia with the first fleet. Amongst them was Esther Abrahams, who in 1808, as the partner to Lieutenant George Johnston, became the colony's unofficial First Lady. Jewish worship in Sydney began in about 1817 under the leadership of Joseph Marcus, a former convict. Philip Joseph Cohen, a free settler, held services in his home from 1828. Jewish congregations were formed in Hobart, Launceston, Melbourne, Adelaide during the 1840s, Brisbane in 1886, Fremantle in 1887. The majority of about 1,000 convicts, Jewish convicts who arrived in Australia between 1788 and 1868, came from England. They included tailors, watchmakers, shoemakers, etc., etc. After emancipation, many rose to high positions in commercial and political life. They were joined by settlers mostly from England, but also from Germany, and later by refugees fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland, like my great-great-grandfather. During World War I, 11% of the Jewish community enlisted, 11%. During 17% of those lost their lives. Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, the Australian Commander-in-Chief, was born in Australia, but came from a Polish Jewish family. In 1917, the New South Wales Legislative Assembly had to close on Yom Kippur because both the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker were Jewish. In 1931, Sir Isaac Isaacs, formerly a parliamentarian and then a member and Chief Justice of the High Court, became Australia's first-born Governor-General. Of course, Sir Zelman Cowen followed. We now have Jews from over 80 countries who call Australia home. These proud Jews went on to shape Australia to the great and prosperous country that it is today. Leaders in philanthropy, the arts, science, medicine, law, and so on. Leaders in the Parliament like former Government Minister Barry Cohen, whose state funeral I was honoured to officiate at in last year's first sitting week of Parliament. May you rest in peace. A record number of Jewish politicians in Parliament today, on all sides of the political divide, each making their own unique contributions. All this with notwithstanding us being, at what percentage of the Australian population? 0.5%. So when they ask us to just be Australian, well, quite honestly, I'm not sure how you can get more Aussie than that. However, throughout the country, disturbing episodes of hate and anti-Semitism are becoming more frequent. It is no secret that we've sadly had our fair share of incidents in our community in Canberra and in our home. On a national level, not a week goes by without another horrific story of hate needlessly endured by Australia's Jewish children. Just this past Sunday morning saw iconic Bondi Beach and Bondi Junction defaced with swastikas. But what are we doing about it? Do we just continue to go through the motions, condemn it with some well-structured words and move on with business as usual? Surely this can't be reflective of being a gold medal winner in the worldwide multicultural Olympics. The Jewish mindset has historically been here that we should never whinge about it and have people think we're playing the victim card. Oh no. Nobody likes whingers. It'll just cause them to hate us more. Countless times I've been told that as a child. Well, I dare to have a whinge today. I do think we should strive for better. The vast majority of Australians still do not want this in their name. There is nothing more Australian than going from good to better. Otherwise, we risk dropping the ball, and those hating continue to become more emboldened. Complacency and satisfaction with the status quo could yield catastrophic consequences. My grandfather, shortly before he passed away, warned me that if our society were to become complacent with all of its achievements, then he believed the Holocaust could, heaven forbid, happen again today. My weekly SMS message to the community last week simply stated, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you're just sitting there. One of my mentors and a great mystic, Rabbi Mendel Futterfass of blessed memory, who survived years in the Soviet Gulag for his commitment to preserving Judaism despite the communist agenda, managed to escape Russia in his later years and make it to Israel where he taught until his passing. He used to often give the example of bike riding. When you are working hard, you're going uphill. When it is easy, you're going downhill. But never stay in one spot or you'll fall. Interfaith dialogue and events on this level are a very important step in the right direction. It is wonderful and all lovey-dovey and always leaves me with a warm and fuzzy feeling inside. But does the goodwill of those in faith and political leadership filter down to those in the street? Is it filtering down to the children in our public and private schools? Does it reach the people in the pub, in the footy? And finally, does it really permeate all our respective houses of worship, our churches, our mosques, our synagogues, and other places? If you want to know how multiculturalism is really working in Australia today, you need to ask those on the front lines in our streets. You need to ask the Jewish boy who walks with a kippah on his head. You need to ask a Muslim woman who wears a hijab over her hair in public. You need to ask a Sikh man who dons his turban every morning. You need to ask an Australian girl from China who takes the train to school every day. We should ask an Indigenous Australian how they feel about the successful utopia. You can ask an African migrant how they are finding their employment opportunities. Their answers might shock you to the core. Racism, historically, starts with the Jews, but never ends with us. So many other minority groups in Australia feel and report today that they feel in the category of the other and are despised for it. Chabad Hasidic philosophy speaks of the propensity of every human to develop a hatred of the other just by virtue of them being the other. Because secretly deep down, in what we call the evil inclination in each of us, the human wants everything for himself. The mere existence of the other could drive it nuts. The human loves his own existence, and if someone interferes with that self-love and that love, then intolerance and hate can develop very quickly, especially if the other holds different beliefs or looks different. On a more mystical level, the Kabbalah explains that because we all have that divine extension within our souls, therefore, as a byproduct, we feel that we are our own gods and the world should be our kingdom. Because within the framework of free choice and creation, wherever good was created, there is potential inherent for the other side, the evil. We have a saying, going to the synagogue makes you a good Jew, like going to the garage makes you a car. So what is the real message we should be taking with us from our respective faiths, and particularly from monotheism, on multiculturalism and multi-faith or multi-ethnic coexistence? Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, makes a fascinating case for interfaith in his book, Not in God's Name. In the very beginning of Genesis, we find the problems which we have experienced throughout history with people of faith not getting along. The very first act of Adam and Eve's children recorded is their desire to give an offering to God. And it concludes with God rebuking Cain that his brother's blood is crying out to him from the ground. The Bible is saying, don't think religion is naturally peaceful. It is full of complex drama, full of good-intentioned people, conflating the voice of God with the voice of the internal demons, otherwise known in Chabad philosophy as the good inclination within versus the animalistic inclination within. The late Professor René Girard espoused that the primary driver of human violence is sibling rivalry. Having a few children ourselves, we can tell you firsthand how we witness this fascinating phenomenon all of the time. One child gets a new toy or treat, the other children would never have even thought about it, nor desired it, or have known about it. But as soon as they see it, they want it, and sure enough, a fight ensues. I'm needing to constantly train them to be happy with their lot, and not to be jealous. Look, after all, God himself says in Genesis that he regretted creating man, because their natural tendencies from birth are selfish and negative. It is not by chance that the 10th commandment is not to covet thy neighbor's wife, house, or possessions. We see the same theme of sibling rivalry woven throughout Genesis. But if you pay careful attention, you will notice what happens in the final scene of each case and how there is gradual generational progression. The last scene of Cain and Abel finds Abel murdered. The last scene in Isaac and Ishmael, they are standing together, paying respects at their father Abraham's grave. The last scene of Jacob and Esau is that they embrace and kiss and then go on their separate ways. But the last scene in Joseph and his brothers is forgiveness and reconciliation. The Bible is telling us that we can be like Joseph and his brothers. It does not have to end in tears. We do not have to choose the path of hate, rivalry, and violence. We can choose peace. One of monotheism's greatest gifts to mankind lies within this juxtaposition. That on the one hand, each person is created in the image of God, and that on the other, regardless of how bad a person seems, each person has the ability to display the best of humanity and have good emanate from them. Take the evil Pharaoh as an example. His daughter's compassion saved Moses and led to our people being freed from slavery and the subsequent Abrahamic faiths to grow. Let me ask you this, people of the Bible here. What is the commandment repeated the most in the Bible?
Richard can answer for sure.
Your neighbor as yourself.
Havat Hager, loving the convert, loving the stranger.
Excellent. We have another rabbi in the room here. You cheated. Well, it's good nobody said one of the others.
I was going to love thy neighbour, but you beat me to it, so.
That's good. So the commandment is, correct, love the stranger, care for the stranger. This is mentioned no less than 36 times in the Torah. We cannot ignore the plight of the stranger. We cannot hold someone in contempt for their faith, being in the realm of strange or foreign in contrast to our own. We must embrace and love the other and the less fortunate, regardless. For as we said before, the essence of God is in the extension of the human soul. I often contemplate how it was that a man some 4,000 years ago who was seeking the truth, Abraham, became the first Jew and the father of the great monotheistic faiths together with his wife Sarah, and merited to such greatness where more than half of the world's population until today affiliate with one of the Abrahamic faiths. About 2.5 billion Christians, 1.8 billion Muslims, and a few Jews for good measure. How did it happen? The simple answer is that he introduced and practiced at the right time the values that the world so desperately needed. The belief and faith in the one God, fighting for social justice. Our sages teach that his most compelling act was opening his tent in the most vulnerable places to all and sundry. Opening the tent for the needy. Something highly irregular for those times. Cute drawing I found. Loving the stranger. They recognize the humanity inherent in every human being and the need to be there for them. Physically, materially, and then spiritually. Perhaps this is why Abraham and Sarah remain the most significant influences in history, and their way of life serves as an eternal guideline for us to know how to live. A man once came to a rabbi and complained, "Rabbi, what should I do that my children are not going in the direction that I want them to go in? I keep telling them to go on the straight and narrow and what to do, but they don't listen to me, they disappoint me." The rabbi looked at him and said, "What are they supposed to do? It seems that your actions are shouting so loud that your children aren't able to hear your words." There were many types of spiritual preachers and pagan religions at the time of Abraham, including those promoting human sacrifices. But what remains of them today? Abraham was a preacher of a different kind. He actually practiced and truly believed in what he was preaching, the theme of one God and one humanity. Abraham got it. Abraham was a man of action. He really meant it. Loving the stranger was his bread and butter. Perhaps the most enduring message of the Bible and the Abrahamic faiths is the value of life. One humanity. Saving a life is like saving a world. That each person has infinite worth, and we must do our best to be as responsible as possible to another whenever we can. But therein lies the dilemma as well. How can we all get along? How can we reconcile other people's incompatible religious and political beliefs with our own to the extent that we can all proudly pray differently, dress differently, look different, yet still have a socially cohesive existence with each other in harmony? Is it even possible? I've seen the argument made again lately that everyone needs to assimilate into one Australian culture and put all the other cultures on the side. Only then we can all live in harmony. But let's go back to the timeless teachings of the Torah. Embedded throughout the Torah, throughout the Bible, we have the recipe as to how a multicultural society should function. Let us take Noah's story as a classic case in point. The world had become a nasty place. There was no rule of law of any kind. People were ruthlessly killing each other without consequences. Theft and looting was rampant. They were cruel to animals. They had no morality or modesty. God pressed the reset button, but saved Noah and his family. Noah exited the ark, and God made a rainbow. A rainbow is a covenant that he will not destroy the world again, and the rainbow will be for us as a reminder to behave whenever we see one. But why a rainbow and not, say, a scary figure of Satan in the sky? Surely that may have been more effective as a reminder than a beautiful rainbow. The simple reason is that the 7 colors of the rainbow represented the 7 universal ethics and laws, known as the Noahide laws, that was to govern all mankind in order to live godly, meaningful, and productive lives. In Jewish ideology, Judaism is not the religion for all of humanity, but it is there to inspire universally. We teach that any righteous human, of whichever faith, adhering to the 7 Noahide laws, has a pathway to the divine and to the world to come. However, on a deeper level, the rainbow's 7 colors represent the different types of people in the world. Like the 7 branches of the menorah, the candelabra in the Jewish temple. Each golden branch representing diverse personalities, tradition, races, and beliefs. Each person with their own unique role in this world. All major calamities that have befallen mankind historically has only been a result of intolerance and hate. The way to regulate stability in the world, says God, is by remembering our role in being that rainbow. Here is the secret of the divine instruction on how to accomplish multiculturalism. Not by being the same, God forbid, as continually suggested. That is not how God created us, and that is not how He wants us to be. We are 7 billion odd humans, and not one of us are exactly identical to another. The Jewish Talmud says not in body and not in soul. We're all different. We need to have diversity in order to have beauty. If we would have all been the same, it would just be one color. God is saying, learn to embrace each other with dignity, and together you will all contribute to create a successful world which shines with the multicultural beauty of humanity. You should all serve me differently, but for you to be individually united by common central values. Like the Jewish tribes camped in the wilderness for 40 years, each in their own tribe, in their own tents, but encamped around and facing the ark and what it represented. The united values as the glue that sticks us together as a nation. The famous Christian scholar and author Thomas Cale, in his book The Gift of the Jews, points out that all of our Western civilization and values which we enjoy today traces back to the Jewish people, to Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments. This, he proves, form the basis for our civilization and all of our laws that govern us, declarations of independence and freedom, constitutions, all the way down to our privileged way of life, which many take for granted today. The values of egalitarianism, democracy, pluralism, liberty, religious freedom, sanctity of life, charity, embracing our civic duties, a fair go for all. These are our core Australian values, influenced by our shared Abrahamic religious teachings. And these are the values we need to constantly rededicate ourselves to as Australians. And by our actions, not just by our words, we will influence others to do the same and experience the most successful multiculturalism the world has ever seen. We can excel in harmoniously living together and achieving lasting unity, not in spite of our differences, but because of our differences. In the recognition that we must not just tolerate difference and the other, but we must cherish it. There is a special prayer for country and our elected leaders which is recited in synagogues around Australia every Shabbat. The concept of praying for the well-being of government started in 586 BCE by the prophet Jeremiah after the first expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem. It seems that Jeremiah was a foremost expert on reconciling religious and cultural differences in a foreign nation. Seeing that the Jewish people could no longer govern themselves, they implored God to guide their foreign rulers. As Jeremiah stated, "Seek the welfare to the city to which you have gone, and pray to God on its behalf, for in its peace and prosperity you shall find peace and prosperity." He told them, in effect, maintain your identity while contributing to the common good. Be true to your faith while being a blessing to others and praying for them regardless of their faith. A nation should respect its faith, and faith ought to respect the nation. That is the only way we will achieve integrated diversity and the dignity of difference, in which we see our differences as contributions which we all bring to the common good. The story is told of the king who had 2 sons, and he sent them each off from the palace when they were young with a bag of gold each and said, "Go make your own life. Build your name. Build your own wealth." Sent them out there. The boys took the challenge and left, but the king told them one last message, that when they are ready to get married, they should send word to the palace and the king will come back to the wedding and bring them back to the palace if they so wish. Upon arriving at the destination, they did as their father suggested and separately invested their funds. One brother became hugely successful. The other's investments fell flat and he lost all his money. The rich brother ended up in a mansion. The poor brother ended up in a broken down shack and lived as a beggar. The rich brother would not help his poor brother, as he felt that his father wouldn't have wanted him to intervene. Years went by, the rich brother found a bride. He sent word to his father as promised to come to the wedding, notifying of the wedding date. On the designated date, the king arrived in the land and inquired about his 2 sons. Upon hearing of the fate of his prince-turned-pauper, he immediately went to that son's shack. The poor son was not planning on going to the wedding because his brother had abandoned him. The father, upon hearing this, decided he will keep the poor son company and not attend the wedding either. The priest, in the meantime, was waiting for the nuptials to be recited, but the groom was insistent to wait for his father, the king. The guests eventually became very impatient, and the groom found out that his father was in his brother's shack. He ran to his brother's shack and quickly came up to his father, the king, but he was stopped by the king's entourage, and the king called out to the rich son and said, "Stop, who are you?" Flabbergasted, the rich son looked at the king and said, "I am your son." The king responded, "No, you are not my son. He is my son," pointing to the poor son. The incredulous groom was shocked and started screaming and crying, "Father, what do you mean? I sent you the invitation to come. It's my wedding. Everybody's waiting. Please come, please." Father again pointed to his poor brother and said, "I am his father. I am not your father." And the rich son looked at the father and said, "Well, if he is your son, he is my brother, and then that makes you my father." The father said, "Aha, when you will be his brother, then I will be your father." When a brother is not a brother, a father is not father. We, many of us of Abrahamic faiths, have one loving Father to whom we pray and whose blessing we seek. But that blessing hinges on whether or not we are all indeed brothers. One day we will have our reckoning. What will be said at our funeral down here in this world and up here in the next depends on the decisions we make today during our short journeys through life. I'd like to conclude by sharing with you where I feel part of fostering love and understanding to the next generation of Australians and multicultural Australia through actions. It is the goodness and kindness, humanitarian charity and services we established in our community centre in Canberra. Children and adults alike from all the diverse walks of Canberra's life together take part in many of these initiatives. When I see my children at one of the programs sitting around the table together with Muslim children, Christian children, Hindu children, Sikh children, Indigenous children, African migrants, all Australian, all encouraged to practice their own heritage, culture and religion, where they have vegetarian food for the Hindu children, halal and kosher for the Jewish and Muslim children, and so on, and all the children together learning from our religiously inspired values which unite us all in humanity, seeing them laugh, play, and sing together. This assures me that in the years to come, if any of these children witness any racism or bigotry, they will protest it and cause the perpetrator to confine the hatred that never dies to the recesses of their heart, never to be revealed again for fear of enormous social repercussions. Or perhaps, better yet, through seeing this passion, the abuser's approach would then also be transformed to respect, tolerance, understanding, and maybe even love. This is how we change the world for the better. If we can all pull our weight wherever we can, then I am sure we will yet become the most successful multicultural society in the world. And may we merit a time speedily in our days when there will be no more war or hate, and true peace and brotherly love will prevail throughout the world. Amen.